The cameras were rolling when Ibrahim Traoré stood before his nation and said something no African leader facing a coup attempt is supposed to say. That his survival doesn't matter. Not in the way you'd expect from a man who just survived an assassination plot. Not with the usual defiance or calls for loyalty. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to his enemies. He made himself irrelevant. This wasn't humility. It was strategy, and it fundamentally changed the rules of power in Burkina Faso. Most leaders cling to survival because they are the system. Remove them, and the entire structure collapses. That's how coups work. That's how power has been transferred across Africa for decades. You eliminate the figurehead, and everything tied to that person unravels. Policies, alliances, ideologies. Traoré flipped that logic. He stood in front of his people and essentially told anyone plotting against him that killing him would accomplish nothing. Because the movement he represents isn't built around him. It's built around an idea that will outlive him. And ideas, unlike men, don't fall to bullets. This is where the stakes become clear. If a leader can successfully decouple their physical existence from the survival of their agenda, they neutralize the oldest tool in the regime change playbook. Coups lose their efficiency. External pressure loses its leverage. The entire calculus of political destabilization shifts. Traoré wasn't just defending himself. He was rewriting the manual on how power operates in a region where power has always been personal, transactional, and violently contestable. What he proposed was radical. Leadership as a temporary assignment, not a throne. In a continent where presidents cling to office for decades, where constitutional term limits are rewritten to preserve individual rule, Traoré openly embraced replaceability. He framed himself not as indispensable, but as one actor in a larger, collective project. The message was unmistakable. Removing him changes nothing, because the movement doesn't depend on his presence. It depends on shared belief, shared grievance, and shared commitment to sovereignty. This is not rhetoric you hear from strongmen. Strongmen build cults of personality. They centralize decision-making. They make sure every institution, every military unit, every economic lever is loyal to them personally. That's how they protect themselves. But it's also their vulnerability, because once they're gone, everything collapses. Traoré seems to understand that. And instead of fortifying his position through consolidation, he's diffusing it through ideology. He's making the revolution bigger than himself. The implications are staggering. If this model holds, it becomes nearly impossible to dismantle through traditional means. You can't sanction an idea. You can't arrest a collective consciousness. You can't stage a coup against a movement that's already prepared for its leader to be replaced. This shifts the entire dynamic of political resistance in the Sahel, where foreign powers and regional actors have long relied on decapitation strategies. Remove the leader, install a compliant replacement, restore the old order. But if the leader is replaceable by design, the strategy fails. And that's the real threat Traoré poses. Not to his domestic rivals, but to anyone who benefits from Burkina Faso remaining weak, dependent, and governable from the outside. His message wasn't just to his people. It was a warning to Paris, to Washington, to anyone watching. This isn't about me. And you can't stop this by stopping me. Ibrahim Traoré just did something that destabilizes every power structure built on intimidation. He publicly removed fear from the equation. Not through bravado, not through military posturing, but by stating, clearly and without ambiguity, that killing him accomplishes nothing because the force driving Burkina Faso's transformation isn't him. It's the awakened consciousness of millions. And you can't assassinate consciousness. That single shift, if it holds, renders obsolete the primary weapon used to control African nations for generations. Fear is the infrastructure of coups. It's the reason why a midnight raid, a public execution, or a targeted assassination can collapse entire governments. The logic is simple. Create enough terror around the consequences of resistance, and resistance stops. Remove the leader, and the movement dies with them. Install fear deep enough, and populations stay compliant. This has been the playbook across the Sahel, across the continent, for decades. Traoré's message directly attacks that playbook. He's telling his enemies that their most reliable tool no longer works. This is where the stakes become clear. When a leader publicly declares that their death is irrelevant to the survival of their cause, they strip violence of its political utility. Coups are designed to create vacuums. Assassinations are meant to decapitate decision-making. External pressure relies on the assumption that if enough pain is applied to the right person, policy will bend. But if the person is replaceable and the policy is owned collectively, none of those tactics deliver the outcome they're designed for. The entire system of fear-based governance loses its foundation. What Traoré is signaling is that Burkina Faso's current trajectory isn't dependent on his survival because it's rooted in something broader: popular awakening. He's arguing that once a population understands its own power, once it internalizes the idea that dignity and sovereignty are non-negotiable, that shift can't be reversed by killing individuals. You can remove leaders. You can't remove awareness. And awareness, once widespread, becomes the new terrain of political struggle. This has profound implications for how power is contested in the region. Historically, African movements that threaten entrenched interests are neutralized through violence. A coup here, an assassination there. Sometimes it's internal factions. Sometimes it's external actors working through proxies. The pattern is consistent. Identify the leader, remove the leader, watch the movement collapse. Traoré is preemptively closing that pathway. He's making it clear that his removal won't deliver the reset his adversaries are hoping for. And that changes the calculation for anyone considering intervention. If you can't rely on fear to control populations, and you can't rely on decapitation to stop movements, your options narrow dramatically. You're forced into far more complex, far more uncertain strategies. You have to either engage the ideas themselves or accept that the old methods of influence no longer apply. Neither option is appealing to powers accustomed to managing Africa through coercion and selective removal of inconvenient leaders. What happens next could redefine the region. If Traoré's framework proves resilient, it creates a model for other Sahel nations facing similar pressures. It demonstrates that leadership can be structured in a way that survives assassination, sanctions, and sabotage. It shifts the locus of power from individuals to collectives, from personalities to principles, and it forces adversaries to confront a far more difficult challenge. How do you destabilize a movement that expects and plans for the loss of its leaders? But there's a counter-argument. Movements built on collective consciousness are harder to control internally as well. Without centralized authority, they can fracture. Without a singular figurehead, they can lose coherence. The question is whether Traoré and those around him can maintain unity and direction in a decentralized model, especially under the kind of pressure Burkina Faso is facing: jihadist insurgencies, economic strain, regional isolation, and the ever-present threat of external destabilization. Ibrahim Traoré just told an entire nation that power doesn't come from the barrels of guns, the approval of foreign capitals, or the offices of government. It comes from them. And in doing so, he didn't just challenge Burkina Faso's political elite. He challenged the entire architecture of influence that has kept the Sahel dependent, divided, and controllable for generations. Because if people start believing that sovereignty lives in collective will rather than institutional authority, then every external lever of control, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, military aid conditions, loses its grip. This is a direct assault on how power has traditionally been structured across Francophone Africa. For decades, legitimacy flowed downward. Presidents derived authority from international recognition, military strength, and access to foreign capital. Citizens were subjects of that system, not sources of it. Traore flipped the direction. He's arguing that worth, dignity, and power originate with the population, and that institutions exist only to express that collective force. It's not symbolic. It's structural, and it redefines where legitimacy comes from. This is where the stakes become clear. If a government's authority is rooted in popular belief rather than external validation, it becomes far harder to delegitimize from the outside. Sanctions lose their psychological impact. Diplomatic isolation becomes less threatening. Even military pressure becomes less effective if the population sees itself as the ultimate source of sovereignty. Traore is essentially telling Burkina Faso that no foreign power, no regional bloc, no international institution can grant or revoke their right to self-determination. Only they can. What makes this particularly destabilizing to the old order is that it reframes poverty and dependency not as natural conditions, but as political choices imposed from above. This matters because dependency has always been the easiest way to control African states. Keep economies reliant on foreign aid. Keep security forces dependent on external training and equipment. Keep political elites more accountable to Paris or Washington than to their own people. As long as survival depends on external approval, sovereignty remains theoretical. Traore is telling his population that this arrangement is a construct, not a fate. And constructs can be dismantled. He's also doing something more subtle but equally important: unifying social, military, and cultural identities around a shared narrative. Soldiers aren't just enforcers of state power. They're participants in a collective project of dignity. Citizens aren't passive recipients of governance. They're co-owners of sovereignty. This blurs the line between military and civilian, between state and society, in a way that makes internal fractures harder to exploit. It creates alignment not through coercion, but through shared belief. And belief, when it's genuinely widespread, is far more durable than fear. You'll see why this moment matters when you consider the regional context. Across the Sahel, military governments are struggling to justify their legitimacy. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. All of them face accusations of being juntas, of lacking democratic mandates, of ruling through force. Traore is offering a counter-narrative. That legitimacy doesn't require elections if it has popular alignment. That authority doesn't need foreign endorsement if it reflects collective will. This is a direct challenge to the liberal internationalist framework that defines what makes a government legitimate. And it's resonating. The danger, of course, is that rhetoric without delivery creates disillusionment. If the economic situation doesn't improve, if security doesn't stabilize, if sovereignty remains more slogan than reality, then the entire framework collapses. People can only sustain belief in their own power if that power produces tangible outcomes. Traore is building a political identity based on dignity and self-determination. But dignity doesn't pay bills, and self-determination doesn't stop jihadist attacks. The question is whether the narrative can hold long enough for the material conditions to catch up. The coup attempt against Ibrahim Traoré failed, but not because his security apparatus was too strong or his intelligence network too effective. It failed because the framework it was designed to exploit, fear, dependency, individual power, no longer exists in the way it used to. And that's not a military outcome. That's a societal shift, one that makes Burkina Faso far harder to destabilize using the playbook that has worked across Africa for the past 60 years. Traditional coups succeed when removing one person creates a vacuum. The logic is mechanical. Eliminate the leader, fracture the command structure, seize key institutions, install a replacement. It works because power is centralized, loyalty is personal, and legitimacy is tied to individuals rather than ideas. But when a society starts operating under a different logic, when leadership is treated as temporary and collective consciousness as permanent, the entire mechanism breaks down. You can still stage a coup. You just can't guarantee it will achieve anything. This is where the stakes become clear. What Traore and those around him are building isn't just a government. It's a political culture that assumes leadership will change, expects external threats, and organizes resilience around shared belief rather than institutional hierarchy. That kind of culture doesn't collapse when you arrest a president or compromise a military commander. It adapts, it replaces, it continues, and that makes it uniquely resistant to the kinds of interventions that have historically kept African states governable from the outside. The failed coup is being presented not as a security event, but as confirmation of a deeper transformation. The argument is that Burkina Faso's population, or at least a significant portion of it, now sees dignity and sovereignty as non-negotiable, permanent values. Leadership is secondary. Institutions are tools. What matters is the collective commitment to self-determination. And once that commitment is genuinely widespread, external pressure loses much of its leverage. Because you're no longer dealing with a fragile state held together by one strongman. You're dealing with a society that has internalized the idea that it doesn't need permission to exist on its own terms. This has profound implications for how power is contested in the Sahel. If unity, awareness, and shared purpose really do make a society harder to destabilize, then the old strategies, bribery, assassination, diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, become far less effective. You can sanction a government. You can't sanction a belief system. You can coup a president. You can't coup a population that expects and prepares for leadership transitions. The battlefield shifts from institutions to ideas. And ideas are far harder to control. What happens next could redefine the region. If Burkina Faso's model proves durable under pressure, it offers a blueprint for other nations facing similar threats. It demonstrates that resilience can be built from the bottom up, through shared identity and collective ownership of sovereignty, rather than top-down through strongman rule or foreign backing. It shows that fear-driven control has an expiration date, and that date arrives when people stop being afraid. But there's a critical vulnerability. Collective consciousness is powerful when it's genuine, but fragile when it's performative. If the rhetoric of unity and dignity isn't matched by tangible improvements in security, economy, and governance, disillusionment sets in. And once disillusionment spreads, the entire framework collapses faster than a traditional authoritarian system would. Because people who believe they had power and agency, only to discover they were still powerless, are far more dangerous to a regime than people who never believed in the first place. Traore is betting that Burkina Faso's transformation is real, not rhetorical. That the failed coup didn't survive because of his skill, but because the society itself rejected it. That the shift from fear-based control to resilience built on collective purpose is already embedded deeply enough to withstand the pressures coming. And those pressures are coming from jihadist groups, from regional rivals, from foreign powers uncomfortable with a Sahel that doesn't need their approval. The question isn't whether Burkina Faso can survive one coup attempt. It's whether the societal transformation Traore is claiming actually exists at the scale and depth required to sustain sovereignty without the traditional structures of control. Because if it does, the entire logic of intervention in Africa changes. And if it doesn't, then this moment becomes just another failed experiment in a long history of African leaders who confused rhetoric with reality. The world is watching to see which one it is.